Back with you. Here we go. Okay, Dev, you're on.
Hey guys, my name is Devin Quesenberry, and I just want to say it's an honor to be here with you guys today. I'm in place of Danny Lewis. As a student of the Bible, and especially as Liberty students, there are a lot of things that we can focus on when given the opportunity to speak. However, rather than wasting your time and mine and tackling questions that we may not even have been allotted to know, I want to focus on something that may be a little bit more knowable to you, something you may know a little bit about already. It's in the Gospel of John. It's at the major dividing point in the Gospel in chapter 13, in which we'll be focusing today. And to give you a little background, the first 11 to the 12th chapter actually focus on Jesus proving his authority and himself as the Messiah. So today we're going to focus on the very first action that Jesus takes to serve an example to his disciples, and that is washing their feet. So if you'll turn to John 13, we'll see that there are two truths that are found exemplified in the behavior of Jesus. And I'm actually going to start reading in verse 1 to give you a full picture, but we'll focus on verses 3 through 5. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around them. My first point this morning is that Jesus humbled himself. And he humbled himself in two ways. The first way is that he actually broke the routine. If you look at the beginning of verse 3, you see that the subject is Jesus. And when observing this passage, it's important to understand that unlike other men in the Bible that we read about, Paul, even the apostles, Jesus is perfection. Whatever he does is perfection, is truth, and is light. So we can actually take that and put it directly into practice exactly the way that Jesus did. So let's pay close attention to the actions that Jesus takes in the passage. The first action he takes is that he rose. And this is just simply mean that he actually got up from dinner. It's also used in the sense of when things are raising and rising from the dead, but here, obviously, he's not being resurrected. He's just getting up from the table. But what did he rise out of? He rose out of his routine, and that is they were sitting down at supper. It wasn't before supper, and it wasn't after supper. It was during supper. Now, coming from American culture, I don't know what you guys practice at your houses, but in my house, you sat till the end of dinner, and or what we call supper. And it was even more so in Jesus' time that supper was the formal meal of the day. It was the one that you don't miss. It's the one that you don't skip. So for Jesus to rise out of that, it would be a huge deal. He and the disciples weren't sitting around with the TV dinner, and he wasn't just interrupting during a commercial. He was actually getting up and interrupting something formal. But what would spur Jesus to take an action like this? Well, let's refer back to the text. If you look at the end of verse 3, it says that he knew something, that he was knowing. The verb here, to know, is used participially to explain the action that Jesus took. You guys will know of it as a contemporaneous type of verb, and you would understand it as a continuous action. So Jesus didn't come to an epiphany, then he just learned, he knew something already. And let's focus more on the information now. There's two things that he knew. The first is that the Father had given all things into his hands. So God the Father had given all things to him as an act of subjection. So the reference to hands is simply referring, like not literally, but metaphorically, meaning it is subjected to his hands. And I use my hands to work, to form things. If you're a potter, I would form clay with those hands. So being under subjection and under the hands are just basically that Jesus had authority to do things with them. The second reason is that Jesus had come from God and he was going to go back to God. Now, this in a way became Jesus' confidence because he came from life, from heaven, from his Father, and then he was going to go there again later. Nothing could change those results, meaning that he doesn't have to be concerned with what happens to him. You guys may be thinking of Romans chapter 9, where it talks about nothing can separate us from the love of God. This is Jesus' confidence, and it can be ours as well. So, Jesus did not rise from dinner for no reason. He did not rise from supper with just a random idea. He rose with a purpose, and that's what we're going to focus on today. In his rising, though, the second point in that, it's just a sub-point, is that he broke traditions to do so. On the 4th verse, it says that Jesus knew they had authority, and so he took off his garments. For us, that would be like an exposure, and understanding that as such, it would be kind of embarrassing for us. The Jews would always wear their priestly attire to be recognized as they were set apart, but Jesus here removed whatever robe he was wearing and put on the robes of a servant here. And so he took a cloth and wrapped it around himself and dressed himself, as we just said, as a servant. So if you think about how to understand this, it's in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 3, verse 13. It says that the angels were ministering to Jesus. We're understood as ministers, and you could also translate this here in this verse as ministering. So Jesus was preparing himself to minister. And what is to minister but to serve? So my second point today is that Jesus served others. He's been prepared through this service. He's taken off his priestly attire, and now he's ready to serve others. And he prepared for service, and you can read this in verse 5. He says, he poured water into a basin. Jesus poured water into a wash basin, and there's nothing besides that. It's just a fact of what he did. However, there is one observation that that can be acquired by this, is that as disciples, they definitely would want the air of Jesus' authority and the confidence that Jesus worked in. However, what they may have skipped over is that they need to be prepared for that. Now, can't we relate to that? We are eager for the influence of a church like Thomas Road. And don't we want the realization of our efforts like Billy Graham, or even the biblical authority of John MacArthur? However, Jesus is preparing for his service. He's filling up the wash basin in this verse. So the next is the connection, is that he performed the service. And it says in the last part of verse 5 that Jesus began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, I just want to illustrate this this morning in saying that I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, and we practice feet washing. Now, I was always afraid to do it because it was kind of gross because you ate a meal beforehand, but I finally had to grow into that rite of passage when I was in our youth group. And the same day that we had our feet washing, I actually had to dig a fire pit for a bonfire that we were going to be having later that week. Came in my nice clothes, didn't want to get those dirty, so I just took off my shoes in order to dig the fire pit. And what happens when you work in the dirt except you get dirty? So my feet became just filthy, disgusting. I put my shoes over it and didn't think anything of it. Then we go in and do the feet washing. We eat the dinner. It's great. And, of course, we have to change the wash basin like 3 times. So, but isn't this what was going on with Jesus? Weren't the disciples' feet just as dirty as mine? Because they didn't have tennis shoes. They had sandals, and they would have been walking all day because that was their main mode of transportation. And so the long story short is that this was what Jesus was doing. He was basically embarrassing himself and sullying his hands during a meal. So to conclude this morning, Jesus completed his action and completed his service as an example to the disciples. He not only showed the great authority that he had, but now he began to show the actions of and the authority of a position that the disciples would have, which is the actions of a service. So I want to leave you with the answer that Jesus gave to his disciples when they ask, why would you do something like this, Jesus? And you can find that in actually verse 12 of the same chapter. At the end of verse 12, it says, and this is Jesus' words, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. For I have given you example that you should also do just as I have done to you." So may these truths characterize us in our lives, not only as ministers, but as Christians. Thank you.
Okay, Dev, total time is 9 minutes and 58 seconds. Let me ask you a question.
Yes,